One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey there, and welcome back to episode 80 of the Inflammation Nation podcast. We're still talking about obstacles to weight loss, and I'm just going to give you a very quick summary of the main obstacles that we've talked about and a couple that are yet to come. So we've talked so far about how high fasting insulin, as well as insulin surges throughout the day, can inhibit fat loss by messing up your lipolytic hormones and activating the hormones that allow you to store body fat. Last episode, we talked about hypothyroidism. Obviously, I'm not going to go through that because I just did it in the last episode. Today, we're going to talk about an increased inflammatory load. And to be honest, the easy conversation would be to repeat some of the things that we talked about as it relates to high fasting and postprandial insulin, and that is changing the hormones, hormone-sensitive lipase, and so on. But we're not going to do that. We're going to talk about some different aspect. And then the final two that we'll get to in different episodes, we'll talk about dysbiotic overgrowth and changes to your microbiota. And then we'll finish this series off by talking about environmental toxins that act as inflammatory drivers. And by that time, you should have a good sound understanding of why inflammation is a bad deal if you're trying to lose weight, but also how these toxic chemicals and other toxins like mycotoxins, for example, can act as hormone disruptors and obesogens. All right, so let's talk about inflammation. And you can go back to one of the very first episodes that I did when I launched the Inflammation Nation just about 8 or 9 months ago. And we talked about inflammation, what it is, just from a general standpoint, and why it's a general problem, not just for weight loss, but for a whole host of different things as well. I want to start off this conversation by looking at some statements or some concepts that were published in a study back in 2017, so fairly recent. And this was in the Archives of Medical Science. And the title of the paper is Obesity and Inflammation, the Linking Mechanisms and the Complications. And this is something that we see throughout the medical literature, whether it's related to weight management and obesity, or if it's associated with things like metabolic syndrome and the spectrum that leads into things like type 2 diabetes. Basically, there is an interconnectedness between things like inflammation, obesity, and metabolic dysfunction. In fact, that was one of the topics that we just went through last weekend. I was teaching on functional endocrinology to a group of about 45 doctors in San Francisco. And that was one of the sections where we talked about what the literature says and what we can take away and translate into clinical practice. So one of the key concepts here to really understand, as I have said before, that there are metabolically healthy obese people and there are metabolically unhealthy obese people. Just because someone carries excess body fat doesn't mean they're a type 2 diabetic. It doesn't mean they have insulin resistance. It doesn't necessarily even mean that they are inflamed. So there is a subset, and the estimates vary. In fact, I saw one paper today that talked about 50% of people who are overweight are metabolically healthy, in the sense that they don't yet have something like metabolic syndrome or type 2 diabetes. Now, a lot of those people who are overweight but not necessarily classified yet as being fully metabolically deranged, a large percentage of those do have underlying inflammatory complaints as well as a predisposition to things like insulin resistance. Again, refer back a couple of episodes when we talked about that. But there are a subset. Now, it's granted it's a smaller subset, but it's a smaller subset of people who are overweight, who are not necessarily inflamed. They don't necessarily have an underlying insulin resistance, and for all intents and purposes, seem to be metabolically healthy. And we'll talk about why that might be. And these people are clearly the exception rather than the rule. Now, there are people who are overweight who have excess body fat, but their excess body fat is predominantly subcutaneous below the skin rather than visceral. And visceral fat is one of the ways that we can subcategorize your fat mass, whether it's subcutaneous or visceral. There are other classification perspectives, which we'll talk about white fat and brown fat. But nevertheless, this smaller subset of people who are overweight, who tend to be metabolically healthy, tend to have more subcutaneous fat than visceral fat. And they more than likely, have more brown fat than white fat tissue in comparison to people who are overweight and unhealthy from a metabolic standpoint. And so you're probably asking, well, what's the difference? If you've not heard this before about the differences between white adipose tissue and brown adipose tissue, it's an important distinction. More and more people, in the blogosphere, the podcast sphere, and social media are starting to talk about this because there's a fair amount of research behind it. And there will be a point where a lot of clinicians are actually accounting for this in their clinical practice. But nevertheless, here's the basic stuff. White adipose tissue, let's call it white fat, basically stores calories and nutrients and expands its own mass either through increasing the number or the size of cells that you have. So you can expand your fat mass and get more overweight, have more body fat by either taking the cells that you already have and just making them larger, or you can actually increase the number of cells. And that's the difference between hypertrophy and hyperplasia. Now, brown fat, on the other hand, also has the capacity to expand its fat mass, but characteristically, brown fat has a far greater capacity to use energy or to burn energy sources like fat as a fuel source rather than store it. And that's perhaps the biggest difference between white fat. Well, I shouldn't say that because there's another major difference, which is the inflammatory state. But let's say that the two major differences between brown fat and white fat, where brown fat is more advantageous, is that brown fat has a greater capacity to use energy rather than simply store it. And as we'll see in a little bit, has a far less capacity to drive inflammatory responses or to become inflamed itself. And that is really characteristic of the white fat. So with brown fat, even though nutrients and energy sources come in, because these cells are living cells, just like your skin cells or the neurons in your brain or the muscles that you use to move around, fat cells are living cells that need blood flow, they need oxygen, they need nutrients, they need vitamins and minerals, they even contain immune cells as well. So even though brown fat cells take in nutrients and energy sources, the brown fat cells, rather than storing it, burns that as an energy source, helping to control the fat mass, but also doing things like producing heat. This is called thermogenesis. And all of this kind of sums up to give us a metabolic advantage. So it is advantageous to us to have more brown fat than less. It is advantageous to us to not have our fat cells inflamed in general. And it is more advantageous for us to carry more subcutaneous fat versus visceral fat. And that's, I think, a fairly good generalization of these different types of fat cells and fat tissues. Now, in general, again, the people who have the most brown fat, the advantageous kind, tend to be younger and thinner. And we tend to lose brown fat as we age, especially if we age and we start gaining body fat and our weight begins to creep up a few pounds here, a few pounds there, and all of a sudden you're a few decades older, but you're carrying around 40 extra pounds that you didn't used to have. That's generally a bad thing. And so really the discussion about inflammation as an obstacle to weight loss, more specifically fat loss, really has to focus on the impact of inflammation on white fat cells, as well as the impact of white fat cells on inflammation, because it is a circular problem. And then talk about what inflammation does to their metabolism and what strategies can we employ maybe to increase the amount or the activity of brown fat cells, or even teach white fat cells to act like brown fat cells. And that's a process that's called beiging, like the color beige, not Beijing as in China, but the color beige, beiging, meaning turning white towards the brown spectrum. But first, let's talk about adipokines. Adipokines are mostly protein-based chemicals that are produced by fat cells, and they serve a very wide range of functions. The first adipokine was, I believe it was leptin, discovered back around, let's call it the early 1900s. And you may have heard of leptin before as your main satiety hormone. Basically, if your leptin signaling works well and your fat cells are healthy, when you eat, when you have consumed enough calories, your fat cells actually release leptin, which then floats up to your brain, plugs into a receptor in your hypothalamus that says, hey, you're full, stop eating, you don't need any more food. Now, obviously, hunger and satiety signaling can get dysregulated quite easily. And we see this a lot with people who have blood sugar issues and thyroid issues, and they carry excess body fat. Basically, there are people who don't know they should eat when they have a need for increased nutrition and energy intake. And there are people who are hungry all the time, regardless of whether or not they actually have a physiological need for food. And something that I have to coach my one-on-one clients on all the time, and this is only when it's appropriate, because it's not everybody, but it's very common. One of the things that we have to go through is a discussion about how you just have to eat for function right now, because your hunger satiety signaling is not something that you can trust. Just because you think you're hungry doesn't mean you need food, or the reverse is, just because you're not full doesn't mean you shouldn't stop eating. And sometimes it's a fine line to kind of find the balance between those things. And it's a process, just like pretty much everything else. So back to leptin, adipokines first discovered back in the 1990s, but since then, researchers and scientists have discovered literally hundreds of other adipokines. Now, some of these adipokines are, for example, immune chemicals that are produced by immune cells that just happen to serve specific functions if it's being produced inside a fat cell, because you can actually have inside a fat cell, which you need to kind of think of that as just a big container that holds other things, most notably body fat. But inside the fat cells is just the wide spectrum of immune cells that you might expect, things like macrophages or neutrophils or lymphocytes, and they can produce any number of different immune-based chemicals, which we think, well, that's weird. Why is a fat cell producing inflammatory cytokines? Well, it's because inside the fat cell are immune cells that tend to get called there when the system is inflamed. But I'm getting just a little bit ahead of myself. Let's talk about some of the other adipokines you might have heard of. You may have heard of something called adiponectin or resistin, interleukin 6, which is a very commonly spoken about pro-inflammatory cytokine from your immune cells that is produced as an adipokine from the fat cell. But remember, it's only because there's an immune cell inside the fat cell making the inflammatory chemical itself. And like I said, you see all types of different immune cells living inside your fat tissue. So we're so far beyond the point where we think of your body fat as a passive energy storage depot. Particularly when you have white fat mostly, and when you have visceral fat, and when you have inflamed fat cells, then that fat mass becomes a metabolically active contributor to systemic inflammation, as well as a wide range of metabolic dysfunctions, or we could just say metabolic derangement, just from a general standpoint. So here's how this works. And this is top level stuff, right? There's a lot more nuance and details. And for any general rule, I might say, like if I say in general, there's always exceptions, right? Of course, there's always exceptions. But in general, when fat cells become inflamed, just like any other living tissue, there's a fairly predictable set of chemical changes that occurs that promotes obesity and weight gain. First is the production of some pretty classic pro-inflammatory mediators like interleukin 6 and another one called TNF-alpha. And again, these are among some of the more commonly researched pro-inflammatory cytokines, and they're ones that are being talked about in clinical settings. And certainly if you get out again on podcasts or the internet, social media, people talking about inflammation are very commonly going to talk about interleukin 6 and TNF-alpha and interleukin 1 and interleukin 1b and all these different pro-inflammatory mediators. So that's the first thing, is that the fat cells, when they become inflamed, produce more inflammation. The second is that as a result of the inflammation and the metabolic changes in the fat cells, we actually get the suppression of that other adipokine that we talked about called adiponectin. And adiponectin is very advantageous because it improves glucose handling. It improves the utilization of fat. It protects against things like cardiovascular disease. It's good for your brain. It protects against type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome. So we want to have an adequate amount of adiponectin. And in that sense, adiponectin as an adipokine, in fact, I want to say that it's the one that's predominantly produced by our fat cells under normal healthy conditions. I might be off on that. I might have to clean that up in a later episode if I go back and discover I was not remembering that detail correctly. But nevertheless, if we look at the normal role of adiponectin and leptin in healthy people, they work together. They work together to control hunger and satiety, so you're not either undereating or overeating. They work together in general to control the behavior of your fat mass, your inflammatory state from that perspective, your glucose handling, as well as your ability to break down body fat and then burn that as a fuel source. But under unhealthy conditions, when fat cells become inflamed, and I'm not even talking about all the different reasons why you can become inflamed. So let's just say for any reason that you might be inflamed, it can drive these mechanisms and drive these processes. We see this net general shift in the fat cells themselves towards an inflammatory state, which then contributes to all the inflammatory issues around the whole body. It's not just your fat cells. And then there's a suppression of this other adipokine called adiponectin. And what ends up happening is, with the net result of these, is we see an alteration in glucose management, blood sugar control. We see you're more likely to mishandle blood sugar, particularly if your diet is heavy in carbohydrates. Even if you're eating a lot of favorable carbohydrates, it can be an issue and a problem. And these things are a result not just from more body fat and more inflammation, but part of this cycle is abnormal handling of fat and glucose metabolism, coupled with the inability to break down body fat and then to use it as a fuel source in a process called beta oxidation. And I'm just throwing that out there just so that you know that these are well elucidated and known and understood metabolic pathways. Like, we know how we make glycogen, we know how we get glucose and how we use that as a fuel source. We know how we lay down body fat. We know how we get rid of body fat and use it as a fuel source. These are all the known biochemical pathways for quite a long time. But again, these changes sum up to increase the risk for heart disease. They actually promote more obesity in a cyclical fashion, promote hypertension, type 2 diabetes, and the cycle just continues and continues. Now, the other things that happen is in the domain of fat mass expansion, like I mentioned just in the introduction. And again, you might recall in some prior podcasts, I did talk about these two different ways that you can increase your fat mass. Number one, and I know I'm repeating myself, but this is important stuff because it's some of these kind of lesser known facts about how our body works that can sometimes unlock your potential to make the changes that you're looking for. So the first thing is, if you have already added more fat mass than you need to have, or if you find that you're in the process of doing that, you can increase the number of cells, the fat cells that you have, one of two ways. You can increase the number of cells you have. Let me go back and clean that up again, because I just heard myself as I was saying it. You can increase your fat mass one of two different ways. One is to increase the number of cells that you have. That's called hyperplasia, fat mass or fat cell or adipocyte hyperplasia. And it turns out that's the best way to get fat, because more healthy fat cells is not a more unhealthy fat cells is not a metabolically favorable thing. You might guess that metabolically healthy obese people probably have fat cell hyperplasia, an increase in the number of healthy fat cells. But these are the ones that burn energy and they don't pump out inflammatory chemicals. And so having more of healthy functional cells is not necessarily a bad thing. And again, metabolically healthy obese people is that kind of small subsection. But the other way that you can increase your fat mass, and this is really the unfavorable way, is through fat cell hypertrophy. And that means, particularly if you have more visceral fat and more white fat than brown fat, which actually we all do, but I should say you have less brown fat than healthy people. Basically, with fat cell hypertrophy in an inflamed, unhealthy state, that means that your sick fat cells simply get bigger, and which means not just more capacity to hold more body fat, which they do readily and easily, but an increased ability to create more inflammation and to continue to dysregulate your glucose and fat metabolism to greater and greater degrees. But there's even one more aspect to this. And so it turns out again that when fat cells get inflamed, particularly white fat cells, remember, those are the less favorable fat cells that will store more fat than consume it and burn it off. When these cells are inflamed, then the blood vessels that feed these cells, because remember, these are living tissues, right? They need nutrients, they need blood flow, they need oxygen, they need glucose or fat, and all these things for their own function. But when these unfavorable white fat cells get inflamed and store more body fat and become more inflamed, basically the blood vessels that serve the function of those cells and keep them fed start to constrict. And once you constrict past a certain threshold, you actually start to choke off the blood supply and you cause hypoxia, or a reduction in the oxygen availability. Now, if you know anything about basic cell metabolism, you know that the most efficient way to create energy is to burn a fuel source, either fat or glucose, in the presence of oxygen. It's what we call oxidative phosphorylation. If you remember from high school chemistry or biology, you remember the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. That's basically what we're talking about. But what happens when fat cells become hypoxic because they have inflammation causing vasoconstriction and decreasing the blood supply? They start to attract even more immune cells, which then see the hypoxic state as a threat to survival, as an injury, and they start creating more inflammatory chemicals in an effort to fix the tissue damage. So we get inflamed fat cells doing all kinds of unfavorable things, including reducing the blood supply through vasoconstriction, which calls more inflammatory cells and more inflammatory chemicals to that area, promoting the very same problem that they were recruited to try to address. And so the effect is not just compounding the inflammatory state, it is a systemic or a system-wide contributor to inflammation, and round we go on the inflammatory merry-go-round. So what's the key takeaways? Number one, and this is just a quick summary of what we just talked about. Number one, inflammation causes fat cells themselves to become inflamed. And these fat cells increase their size, or as these fat cells increase their size, they're likely to store and not consume more energy. So they hold on to more body fat. The inflammatory chemicals they produce cause systemic inflammation, promotes metabolic derangement, more obesity, risk for cardiovascular disease, and so on. The fat cells themselves become hypoxic, which draws more immune cells to the fat cells, which then produce more inflammation. And we see complete dysregulation of fat and glucose metabolism, such that we certainly can't handle bad carbohydrates in our diet. We can't even handle a lot of good or favorable carbohydrates in the diet, at least not efficiently, which then get laid down as extra body fat and the cycle continues. And we can't get our cells to release their stored body fat to use it for fuel. In essence, we get an inflammatory, hypoxic energy crisis at the cellular level. And that essentially what being unhealthy and being carrying around excess body fat is all about. It's about having all these inflammatory, even hormone and blood supply issues down at the cellular level. So, it sounds like a complicated problem, and in general it is, because not only do you have to start to do things to change the cellular behavior, you have to try to find and fix all the reasons why you might be inflamed. And it just so happens that a lot of the obstacles to weight loss that we've been talking about and will continue to talk about are some of the more common drivers of systemic inflammation, but also inflammation in the adipose fat mass. And in fact, if you look at the literature, look at the obesity research, they talk about all the time how increasing body fat and being inflamed causes obesity, which promotes type 2 diabetes or the development of that. And that circles back around, and this just makes your fat mass more inflamed. And now we're in this kind of infinite loop of self-perpetuation. More fat, more inflammation, more fat, more inflammation, and a decreased ability to get rid of it. So what about some simple strategies? Well, it's more complicated than we're going to get into in just this one episode, because we're just talking about how things happen. But adopting a mindset of, if you're trying to lose weight and it's difficult and just simply cutting calories and increasing activity is not working, then you have to find the sources of your inflammation and your oxidative stress. That's kind of the linchpin. And that might be a big hunt. And it might be something very simple. Everybody's just a little bit different, but don't be surprised if you have more than one contributor to systemic inflammation driving some of these problems. Number two, look for other metabolic reasons, right? Go back and look at blood sugar control and handling and adrenals and gut health and thyroid. Do you have Hashimoto's? Is there other autoimmunity? Are you eating foods that you're sensitive to? Are you stressed out? Are you sleeping well? And all these different things that I've been talking about for the last 80 episodes. But there are some supplements that can help. And I'll tell you, there's not a ton of research here. And most of the research that I've seen is in the realm of supplements that might help in terms of the beiging of white fat cells, like turning them into cells that kind of act like brown cells, because that's what we want. We want more brown fat mass, less white fat. We want the white fat we have to act like brown fat, and we want to get rid of our visceral fat. Certainly, if we had to make a choice, reduce your visceral fat, because subcutaneous may not be the worst offender. Now, what are the supplements? Simple things like fish oil, turmeric or curcumin, and even dietary fiber all have been shown in the literature to help. Now, there are certainly others, and if you just simply Google supplements that help the browning of fat tissue, you'll come with a list of things that you might want to consider using. And I'm certainly not going to give like dosages and all that kind of stuff, because the last thing I want to do is be perceived as giving personalized medical advice, which I'm not. This is all about education, maybe a little bit of entertainment. But the other thing to consider is exercise, because just the simple, and it's a little bit of a oxymoron or a little bit of a contradiction. If you can't lose weight through exercise and you need to change the behavior of your fat cells, one of the ways to do that is to exercise and lose weight. But obviously it's not that simple, because you have to do that in the context of finding and fixing all or most of your inflammatory drivers. All right, so we're going to leave it there. We've got a couple of episodes left to do in this mini-series. The next time we meet, I believe we'll be talking about dysbiotic overgrowth. And I'll try to go beyond just kind of the simple stuff that you can get everywhere else, and just give you some insights. Maybe we'll talk about different testing strategies and whether or not we should be looking at certain types of diagnostics, if you need diagnostics, and if you have an infection in your gut, or if you have an alteration in your microbiome, how can you change that, and what should your expectations be? All right, guys, we'll see you next time here on the Inflammation Nation. Thank you so much for listening to the Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com, that's drnoseworthy.com, to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.